Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Family Therapists' Lived Experiences of Discussing Ethnic Racial Socialization with Latino Parents, being presented by Dr. Melissa Izaguirre. My name is Kayla, and I will be assisting as needed during the session. Before we begin, I would like to provide some general housekeeping information. Please just take a moment to ensure that you have a clean connection. And after the presentation by our esteemed presenter, we will enter a period of participation Q&A. We ask that you please submit your questions through the Q&A box on Zoom. Please also feel free to engage with both the presenters and attendees by using the chat function throughout the webinar. And finally, this is a live webinar and it is being recorded. Also, I'd like you to note that all participants are muted. Thank you to each of you for attending. Now I will turn the session over to Dr. Izaguirre.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kayla. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Bienvenidos and welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Izaguirre, she, her pronouns, and I'm excited to be here with you all today and very humbled and honored to be this year's recipient of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education and Educational Testing Services Outstanding Dissertation Competition. Today, we are going to go over essentially the findings from my dissertation, where we will begin by exploring and understanding the complex integration of practices that family therapists use to translate the concept of ethnic racial socialization into the therapeutic context. And we are also going to recognize a few key therapeutic considerations that family therapists use when working with their Latino parents to engage ethnic racial socialization conversations with their children. And I'm also going to offer a few multi-systemic implications through an iterative process that includes some self-reflection as the family therapists continue to develop their clinical craft. So first and foremost, I'd like to position myself and essentially identify, who am I and why am I doing this work? So my background actually started, I'm a first generation college graduate, second generation Mexican American, and I completed my bachelor's and my master's at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and stumbled upon couple and family therapy, where I really wanted to be able to help families on a systemic level and understand what are some of the influences surrounding their environments that are impacting either mental health outcomes or relationships in the home. And once I completed my master's, I continued my education for a PhD at Michigan State University in Human Development and Family Studies with a concentration in couple and family therapy. Throughout this journey, I have been influenced by wonderful mentors and scholars who have helped me shape and understand my line of research and the passions that I hold regarding not only increasing representation, but supporting our Latino communities. And such, so my research and clinical interests include increasing culturally relevant or culturally responsive and inclusive practices that are available to our mental health providers to be able to understand and equip them with the necessary tools to provide equitable care to diverse populations, specifically Latino populations. And my ultimate goal is to improve the mental health outcomes and strengthen family relationships in systematically marginalized communities, such as the Latino populations. And so prior to going into this study, I think it's important that we talk a little bit more about the background in terms of, what it is, what it means to start living in an emerging majority minority society. So I'd like to begin first with a few statistics and point out that 18.5% of the US population, roughly 62.1 million people in the US, are made up of the Latino population. And this is estimated to increase to 28% by 2060. And unfortunately, this exposure to ethnic racial discrimination remains a prevalent concern in the United States for this demographic, as well as other marginalized populations. Unfortunately, with this continued exposure to ethnic racial discrimination, also it ends up starting to bleed into other areas of their life where disadvantages end up meeting them in their education, employment, medical care, and public safety due to these systemic inequities. And also, ultimately, it leaves a rising concern about the long-term effects of Latino children's overall development and family well-being and their mental health outcomes. However, there is hope. right? And so we're going to start talking about ways that we in the literature as scholars that are either researchers or practitioners have started to identify ways to mitigate these negative effects of ethnic racial discrimination. And first and foremost, it starts with the left-hand side or upper left-hand side here with this concept of ethnic racial socialization, also known as the ways in which parents transmit messages related to race, ethnicity, and culture to their children. And these positive messages are supposed to be meant to be passed down to mitigate these negative effects of ethnic racial discrimination. In the therapy world, as I like to say, we do also have like to back up for a second. So ethnic racial socialization has been represented in the literature. I look at it as much more of a theoretical concept that has helped us to understand ways that ethnic racial discrimination has been mitigated amongst marginalized populations. In therapy or in practice, this is intentionally executed through what is known as culturally relevant practices, or for some of us in the room that have been exposed to relevant terminology such as multicultural competence, or cultural humility. Very similarly, where all of these opportunities are band together to strengthen the therapeutic alliance and increase effective outcomes when considering ways that we can effectively and intentionally bring conversations related to race, ethnicity, and culture into the therapeutic context. However, the gap amongst these two and bridging these two concepts together is essentially identifying the when and how family therapists can bring these conversations into the room with their clients. And such, the gap that exists is that translation of concepts that are already existing in the literature and well established, such as ethnic racial socialization, and translating that into the therapeutic context. In addition to that, being able to provide tangible practices for family therapists seeking to support Latino parents and families to engage in ethnic racial socialization conversations. And so the theoretical frameworks that were used for the current study include the ecological systems theory, which is essentially identifying how human development is influenced over time through exposure to different social environments as represented in the figure on the left-hand side. Critical race theory, enough said, right, is actually drawing attention to the relationships between race, racism, and power. And then the modified integrative model of child development highlights the diversity and strengths of minoritized populations and helps characterize and contextualize the influences on Latino youth development. And now we get into the good stuff. So the research question for the current study includes, what do family therapists consider to be effective practices for supporting Latino parents to engage in ethnic racial socialization conversations with their children? And so the participants that were included in the study included 20 family therapists across the US who were represented amongst 10 different states. Ages ranged between 26 to 61 years and had anywhere between 2 to 36 years of clinical experience. And the therapist client demographics here are reported on table 1 on the right-hand side. I do believe that it is a strong suit of this study to highlight the diverse representation, especially the Latino representation of the family therapists in this study, which we will highlight its relevance later in the findings. I think it's also important to showcase the diverse demographics that they were working with as well, because there were over 16 different ethnic groups represented amongst the Latino clients that the family therapists that I interviewed were talking about and describing. They also range in nativity status, where majority were domestic, some were identified as international, others were unknown. And an important part to highlight here as well is that the generation status amongst these individuals also ranged from first through third generation, with the majority of them holding that first generation status. And what was also beautiful about this study is that we had 15 out of the 20 family therapists who conducted therapy in Spanish or were able to provide bilingual services. About half of the population or half of the sample were native Spanish-speaking family therapists. And so this was a qualitative harmonic phenomenological research approach that was used for this study. And I conducted all of these semi-structured interviews over Zoom. And essentially, the piloted interview guide was comprised of 3 domains from ethnic racial socialization, which include cultural socialization, preparation for bias, and a rising ethnic racial socialization domain known as immigration socialization. And so the interview question started with broad questions such as, when working with Latino parents in your example, did conversations of race, ethnicity, and culture come up or not so much? And followed by, did these conversations include their children? And then I also solicited probing questions to get richer description from the participants, such as, did conversations of race, ethnicity, and culture ever prompt parents to extend conversations to their children? And the interviews ranged anywhere from 52 minutes to 98 minutes, with an average about 77 minutes. And in conducting the qualitative analysis, I used the tenets of Braun and Clark's thematic analysis, where these 6 steps are described in the figure on the right-hand side. And essentially, this is where I described that iterative process, where things were happening simultaneously, because this is not supposed to be a linear process in itself. And so first and foremost, familiarizing myself with the data meant me not only conducting all of the interviews, but also when transcription services were utilized, making sure that I reread the transcripts to ensure that all information was accurate and well represented. The next step is where I started to generate individual concise labels or codes, initial codes. And this step is important to highlight because I was about halfway into the data set when I recognized that something just felt off, or something felt, not right regarding the coding system. And this is where I began to recognize that while I was talking specifically to family therapists, and this was my sample, and I wanted to understand the practices that they were engaging in with Latino parents and families, the therapist did not stop at just letting me know what they were doing. They were also crediting the clients that they were working with. And so when I went back and started looking at the data a little closer, I recognized that there were actually voice distinctions in the responses that these family therapists were giving me. And essentially what they were doing was that in addition to highlighting their own lived experiences, they were also describing their interpretations of their Latino clients at the parent level, family level, and child level, and their experiences in those interactions with them in therapy. As such, I was able to distinguish these voices and really give a full understanding of not only when therapists were leading certain practices, but when the clients themselves were also the ones, and distinguishing when they were the ones engaging in these conversations or perhaps steering these conversations. And moving forward, we were able to identify the domains to organize and distinguish the different rising themes from the data set. And moving forward, being able to define and finalize, especially the themes and sub-themes that were identified in this study. And then the final report for the purposes of this study was the dissertation. And so now to showcase what came about all of this complex iterative process. And so 4 major themes and 11 sub-themes were identified for the current study that identified the family therapy practices that these therapists were using to promote ethnic racial socialization conversations, specifically with Latino parents. However, the findings did demonstrate that these conversations were actually including parents and children. And in order to continue to promote these conversations, we really stress the importance of having ethnic racial socialization conversations with children in order to mitigate the negative effects of ethnic racial discrimination. And so the first theme, participants introduced the necessary groundwork to engage in before pursuing deeper conversations with Latino parents. And so this on the right-hand side demonstrates a quote from one of our participants that stressed that family therapists working with Latino families is a privilege. And as a family therapist, being entrusted with the emotional lives and historical lives of these Latino families, that is a privilege and not your right as a clinician. Don't take that lightly. Show up for those who are making intentional efforts for breaking generational cycles and patterns. Just show up. Be human. Your humanity is going to get you far with these people and they will trust you more. So show up and address these things. Don't overlook them. So important. Don't overlook them. And essentially here, this therapist is embodying the three sub-themes that were identified within this major theme of ways in which family therapists could embody cultural humility or this humbleness and taking a not knowing stance, nurturing the connection, and letting the Latino parents know that they are not in this journey alone, and also promoting safety in various outlets, given that a large portion of the sample was dealing with immigrant and first-generation populations. Safety went as far as letting them know the limits to confidentiality and letting them know in certain cases that they were not affiliated with ICE. Examples that were explicit as this and rationalizing why that held such significant meaning for these clients. The next theme includes ways that participants spoke about approaches to identifying and explicitly naming ethnic racial socialization related topics with Latino parents. And this is broken down into those three domains that were identified in this study, which started with the cultural socialization, which turned into exploring cultural identity and nuances, and then talking about ethnic racial discrimination and recognizing I'm going to pause there because that's a cool finding, and I'm going to go into that in a second. And the final one, approaching immigration, not only that process and preparation regarding having those conversations, but also extending to how therapists became a jack of all trades, and essentially identifying practices and resources that they could extend and learn about themselves to extend resources to their parents outside of the therapeutic context. I want to backtrack a little bit into recognizing ethnic racial discrimination, because the example on the right-hand side highlights a necessary example and an important finding to this study where essentially this individual parent was externalizing this messages of being called offensive names and picking up or the therapist picking up this message from an undocumented parent, where the parent said, you know, that's what I have to put up with, right? I should be grateful for what that I'm in this country and that I have this opportunity. And here, rather than trying to validate or normalize the conversation in front of them, the therapist actually stepped in and said, no, that was not okay. And just because you're undocumented does not mean that you're not valuable and that you don't have a voice or a right to be assertive. And here, trying to re-empower the Latino parent to showcase that just because these encounters happen does not mean that we need to justify them or accept them. Another interesting finding here included where majority of the literature has talked about ways in which marginalized identity or individual has been discriminated against. However, less is talked about when, you know, the Latino parents themselves were the ones discriminating against other groups. And I think that that was a very interesting finding that therapists were talking about very openly here and saying that it's important to recognize that when we as family therapists are placed in a position where Latino parents are the ones discriminating, how we navigate and handle those situations appropriately. The next theme talks about participants describing the practices that they utilize to understand and help Latino parents to conceptualize the generational cultural related messages transmitted from to their children. And so one of the participants here described, my gut feeling is that parents feel panicked at their loss of their identity and the identity of their children. Their culture is very important to them. Being Latino is very important to them, and they see their children wanting to color their hair and do all of this stuff, and they forget that these things are occurring still in Mexico or their country of origin right now. They're just from another generation. And this sums up beautifully in which the therapists themselves identified that from one generation to another, the amount of differences that these Latino parents were grappling with and essentially raising bicultural children, where perhaps these Latino parents grew up in their country of origin and moved to the United States, they were bringing those memories from their country of origin with them and really grappling with having to balance the new cultural nuances that their children were bringing because they were exposed to, you know, American schools, American friends, and being surrounded in a new country with different norms, expectations, values than perhaps the Latino parents grew up with themselves. And so essentially here, the therapist started to describe ways in which they hit the play button on the time of life and helping these parents understand that balance is not necessarily something to be consumed by or overwhelmed by, but perhaps something to embrace and ways for them to break generational cycles related to culture, and also, identify the meaningful parts of their culture that they wanted to pass on to their children, and ways to explicitly have those conversations with their children to empower them, and then also empower the children to want to continue these legacies. The final theme, participants highlighted the various social influences that prompted their desire to continue advancing their promotion of ethnic racial socialization conversations with Latino parents in therapy. And essentially here, what family therapists were describing was that these themes essentially build on one another. You cannot go into these deep conversations without first establishing a solid therapeutic relationship. Once you have established that, you can start to name these conversations and essentially introduce new language, because these conversations are happening in the household. However, maybe they're not as explicit as a therapist would be having with a parent. And then being able to navigate and understand, now that we know terminology and language and normalize that we're not the only ones going through these conversations, what do we want to do with them? What do we want to keep the same? What do we want to change? And finally, therapists rounded this out by saying that it's not enough to just have these conversations and move on. We as practitioners must continue to challenge ourselves to rise to the occasion and change and evolve with the times and the complexities of the different presenting problems that they bring forward to us, as well as ways in which we want to help and learn from our clients. And so one family therapist said, I go home and I'm like, how can I probably explain this better to a parent next time? It's like, how can I, as a therapist, do a better job of providing this information to the parent next time? Or maybe either next time I see them to a different family that are going through similar things. And really recognizing and highlighting that therapists were dedicated to not only learning from their own lived experiences, from their training, from their education, but also from the Latino parents themselves, because no one client is going to be the same. So understanding how we tailor our practices to meet the needs of the clients that we are serving. And so the results did yield several key suggestions that aim to offer practices to family therapists that can promote conversations related to race, ethnicity, culture, ethnic racial discrimination, and immigration with Latino parents in therapy. And given that there's no one way to or correct way to engage in ethnic racial socialization conversations, these suggestions offer thoughtful considerations for family therapists seeking to expand their application of culturally relevant practices when working with Latino parents and families in treatment. And so the first one includes the therapeutic relationship groundwork, where essentially therapists were emphasizing the investment in the therapeutic relationship before positioning themselves to discuss deeper dialogue and personal dialogue with the Latino parents and families. And part of that included embodying cultural humility, where essentially it was highlighted to remain open, to remain curious, and acknowledge the complexities that come with being a Latino individual, and their own cultural background, their lived experiences, and expanding our own knowledge on what it means for our client and the ways that they identify with their cultural identity. And also nurturing the connection, which meant establishing and promoting trust in the relationship and being able to offer them reassurance that they were on the same team, or saying, we are working towards the common goals together. And also being able to provide a background to therapy, where a lot of these participants recognized and acknowledged that for many of their clients, this was the first time they were seeking mental health services. And given the different types of cultural stigma that are often associated with mental health, it was important for us to explain different concepts such as explaining informed consent, policies, procedures, socially locating oneself and saying, here are a couple of identities that I hold, this is my stance, and also this is the type of therapeutic approach that I take, in layman's terms, of course. And finally, promoting safety, where we should prioritize this early on so that our clients feel comfortable, heard, and understood. and reminding them that therapy is a confidential place where we engage in explicit conversations about confidentiality and revisit this whenever sensitive conversations arise. The next area in the implicit messages to explicit conversations, we begin with first identifying how we can broach these conversations with direct language and define introduced terminology. So when we start to explore cultural identity, helping them with broader questions and understanding more about their culture without such direct language, instead being human, like we talked about in the first theme, and asking questions like their experiences with ethnic food, with music, spirituality, gender norms. Also strengthening these conversations by using terms such as values and beliefs when associating cultural topics. And also considering the different nuances that Latino clients bring into the room, such as their physical gestures or sayings or dichos. Also, we move into recognizing ethnic racial discrimination when prevalent for these Latino clients. So we identify the comfort with discussing terms such as discrimination, oppression, microaggressions, racism, and also acknowledging and validating their experiences related to the resistance of unacceptable and unjust encounters. So even when being backtracked and saying, oh, racism, that's a bit of a heavy word. I don't know that I'm ready for that. Being able to step in and say we're usually not, and it doesn't make it okay. And so when Latino clients themselves were the ones discriminating against others, best practice that family therapists were suggesting were to redirect the conversations and to tap into their humanity, their values, and model non-discriminatory language in order to preserve that therapeutic relationship and avoid potential shaming or limiting of the clients or preventing them from likely shutting down. And finally, approaching immigration, which I will put a small asterisk here and say treading with caution, because family therapists who decide to engage in these conversations should first understand their own self-reflection regarding comfort and competency levels related to immigration prior to engaging in these conversations. And if so, and having those levels of competencies and trainings and exposure and potential supervision, being able to revisit and reinforce these conversations through confidentiality with clients, acknowledging one's own level of knowledge pertaining to immigrations and problems related to immigration status, gathering a related history related to immigration experiences and the level of influence that it plays on their day-to-day living, where immigrant populations and first-generation populations may be affected more consistently by immigration versus second or third or later generations. And just holding therapeutic space for Latino clients to process the immigration-related experiences that they have been exposed to. And next, we talk about unpacking cultural expectations, where first therapists highlighted supporting their Latino clients to navigate the similarities and differences that we do know occur across generations, and acknowledging the social context and environments that influence this over time. Really, it's social evolution, and sometimes we just need that reminder that it's happening. And ways in which folks that decided to approach these and navigate these conversations did so by gathering a family history, also known as a cultural genogram. So essentially getting that family lineage on paper and giving a visual effect to some of the changes and helping families to identify if and when these changes were occurring. And so creating space for cultural conversations extends beyond the therapeutic space for parents to process these topics that perhaps were difficult or uncomfortable to address in the room. And so one example that a therapist gave was a child that came out as transgender and parents not really knowing how to grapple with this news and not wanting to say the wrong thing. And therapists here responded by saying perhaps an individual session where we can practice these conversations. These are things that you are also processing and changes you're processing. And if we can do so here, we equip you and prepare you to have these conversations more effectively with your children. And so guiding and facilitating these conversations were used through modeling, role play, and offering opportunities to ask questions. Next was garnering generational viewpoints, where therapists acknowledge the generational shifts in the types of conversations and relationships that were being observed with Latino parents and families. And so essentially, some parents coming in and saying, I want different for myself and my child. I don't want to have that cold shoulder. I want to do things different. I don't want to raise my voice. I want to do things different. And so validating not only the upbringing experiences, but also gathering insight to the changes that they seek for future generations, and also promoting breaking generational chains and offering support by reevaluating the expectations that parents wanted to pass down to their children, giving that weight and that meaning to understanding why it's important to pause and to really reflect and process what meaning these conversations hold in order to be able to promote that with their children. And finally, supporting parents to raise bicultural children, and first and foremost, having that conversation, but also exploring avenues to find balance and respecting the Latino parents' cultural values and beliefs. And finally, these contextual and practice influences and ongoing development, essentially growing from our experiences, which was multifaceted through the different social environment influences that these therapists were learning from their experiences in order to build that therapeutic bond and their therapeutic practices. Part of this included engaging in self-reflection, their own upbringing, especially those that identified with similar identities to their clients, and recognizing that there are still differences no matter how similar our backgrounds may be, and that seeking continuing education and training to increase our knowledge about culturally relevant practices that are available or practices that align with the values and beliefs of our clients, as well as reflecting on the interactions and influences that Latino clients have in shaping our therapeutic practice. We can always learn from our clients. And and finally, summing out that advocate for justice or advocating for a justice, where we increase our understanding of the systemic US structures and environments that are influencing Latino family systems, such as policies, politics, schools, work, neighborhood, and healthcare, and demonstrating allyship by becoming informed about social justice issues, exploring legal partnerships such as immigration lawyers to stay informed with immigration procedures, identifying certification opportunities to support Latino clients to conduct immigration evaluations, which many of these therapists actually went beyond their scope of study or expectations within the therapy room and went on to get certification so that they could conduct immigration evaluations, supporting the Latino clients that were seeking citizenship or permanent residence, and also promoting social justice advocacy in local and national governing bodies. And overall implications for clinical practice as well as training and across disciplines really comes at different and various levels. So at the micro level or individual level, we start with our own self-reflection and adapting our practices to the needs of our clients and learning from our day-to-day experiences. First and foremost, it was the biggest highlight of saying we don't have to know it all, and our clients don't expect us to. They expect us to listen, to learn, and to understand them. And next level, getting that exposure to resources where we translate the services, the legal counsel, the certificates, and the supporting processes related to immigration or other topics relevant for our clients, and extending these resources to them. So while we are getting the direct training, we are indirectly impacting them by bringing those resources to them down the road. At a much larger societal level or the macro level, we can continue to promote advocacy efforts in and outside of the therapeutic context and continue to address and challenge the societal and institutional structures adversely impacting our Latino clients. And overall, combining these different efforts at every level can ultimately promote social change that we wish to see over time, as well as those social justice efforts within our governing bodies, within our organizations, within our workforces, and so on and so forth. And so summing all of this up in terms of moving forward and what the next expectations are, first and foremost, continuing to disseminate the wonderful work that family therapists are already doing to support Latino clients across the US. And what was beautiful about this study is that key finding did suggest that family therapists are social agents of change or supporters that are well equipped to be able to support Latino parents and families to engage in ethnic racial socialization conversations. We are essentially adding ourselves or putting our feather in the hat of that we are also part of the team amongst many other support systems that they already have ready to be able to support them in the adverse challenges that they face. We're also looking to continue this research by monitoring, exploring, and documenting the different outcomes of these conversations to understand and how we are supporting the health and well-being of Latino parents and families, and also considering the different strategies to develop and maximize these as culturally relevant practices that can be translated into different training settings across disciplines, and really understanding and addressing the how and when. And so I'd like to sum out with thanking Michigan State University for funding this study at different levels. I saw that some of our faculty members are actually here. I truly appreciate the support. And it is, I would say it's great to see y'all, but I love to see the name. And rounding this out, if you have any questions or curiosities, this is my contact information. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to come out today. And I would love to address any questions or curiosities that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Isaguirre. Anyone have any questions? And if you want, you can raise your virtual hand and I can send you an invitation to unmute. But looks like we have a question from Ruth. Do bilingual therapists get paid equitably for their extra linguistic skill set?
Wait 1 second, I'm just trying to pop up the.
Oh, you're fine.
Are bilingual therapists get paid? Oh, this is a great question, Ruth. Okay. So this is actually a really great question. I actually did not get a lot of insight in terms of whether or not the family therapists were getting paid extra or equitably for being bilingual therapists. What they did mention, however, especially for folks that were coming from much more rural areas, was that for some of them, they were the only family therapists within a 2-hour radius of their destination that were the only ones providing bilingual services or specializing in working with Latino populations. So I did have a couple of therapists that named the struggles that came with being the only one or having to educate their fellow practitioners and saying that, you too can provide services to these families. Many of them, the sample did come from private practice or community agencies in which they were kind of, implicitly implying the need for more resources in general. And I think that the attention went very similar to Latino culture, less about them and the pay that they were getting and much more the resources that their organization needed to be able to provide equitable services for the populations that they served.
Are there any other questions? Lots of praise, which is good.
Thank you. Thank you for the praise. Much appreciated.
Oh, looks like we have a comment from Edmond.
Yes. Okay, so I'll read this out loud. So considering the trauma that undocumented immigrants may experience from racism, you've emphasized the importance of modeling non-discriminatory language to maintain therapeutic relationships and avoid shaming. In practice, do you find it more effective to first address and correct belief by undocumented immigrants that enduring racism is necessary, or to begin with showing empathy towards the reasons for silently enduring such treatment? The initial response by one therapist when they said racism, no, this was discrimination and it wasn't okay, felt judgmental and harsh as the initial response to the racism experience. No, this is a really valid point and I appreciate you bringing it up. More so because context does matter, right? This was actually a much larger code than what was represented. There was only so much that could go into the slide itself, but I do appreciate that this question came forward. For the family therapist, I think that because the first theme was the therapeutic relationship groundwork, they positioned themselves very well to say that there was enough trust and bond, that the ways in which the family therapist spoke with their client, it was because that rapport and that relationship was there, and the types of language, if you will, that was exchanged with their clients was also well established. And so, with enough rapport, there is a way in which we engage with our clients to let them know in a very soft way that, these experiences, you go through them, and I hear you saying this. It does not mean that you have to accept them by any means. And in other cases where this was a family session, um, very similar to what you're pointing out here, it was actually kiddos or the children in the room that were also acknowledging, you see, it wasn't okay. So when parents were more of like the much more resilient, I guess is the word here, where they were digesting and saying that by me kind of shushing this or shutting it down, I'm protecting my child. And where family therapists said, it is a protection in one way, but it's also eating away at you and it's not necessary. Or children stepping into the conversation and also saying that we see the hurt going on and we are feeling it too. And so when the conversations themselves started to come out into the room, family therapists were describing how they observed the weight lifted off of both generations that were in the room, where children were saying to their parents for the first time, I never knew that about you. I thought I was the only one. I didn't know you were also going through this. And so being able to exchange those types of moments and that vulnerability essentially started with the ability to name it for what it was, which was an exposure to discrimination or racism. And I hope that answered your question. Please follow up if it didn't. What type of supervision did the clinicians receive? Oh, I love it. Thank you, Patricia. So supervision did range. I did have about 2 participants that I should back up. So with the inclusion criteria, we use the multicultural cultural humility scale, where therapists were able to describe the types of culturally relevant practices that they utilize in practice, and one of them being supervision. And so when therapists disagreed to the survey, I allowed them to give a free response as to why they were not getting these items met, and one of them related to supervision. The true therapist, actually named that they were the only one in their area, whether it be practice or geographical location, that were known as the culturally relevant therapists, and they were the ones being sought out. So for some therapists, they said it was very hard and difficult and limiting in terms of seeking supervision because they were the ones being sought after. In other areas, folks were saying that supervision was critical for those that were in states where Latino populations were much more well represented and many more resources were available. There were therapists that said, I am lucky and grateful for the organization that I am part of because, one, I'm not the only Latino therapist, and two, we have intentional training regarding these topics, so I do feel equipped to have these conversations. So depending on where folks were across the US, it really did make a difference in terms of the type of supervision they were getting, as well as being able to apply that in the therapeutic context. Um, mhm. Oh, this is a good one. So loss of identity often happens because U.S. curriculums leave out U.S. histories of Latino, other ethno-racial groups, thus causing harm. Is your field having conversations with the educational leaders to advocate for the inclusion of minoritized groups? Ruth, this is a great question. So I myself am part of this movement. So one of the big shifts that I'm going to name my bias here. So I would say that this is starting to happen very transparently amongst marriage and family therapy programs across the U.S., in that we, as scholars of color, scholars that I believe heavily in diversity and equity and inclusion, are starting movements to shape and reshape how we are executing our diversity curriculum. And part of that includes that traditionally formats related to diversity classes often were perpetrated around racial ethnic groups. And while the intention was to support and bring awareness and raise knowledge across groups, it often tends to do the opposite and reinforce stereotypes and microaggressions. So one of the ways in which I personally, as a diversity instructor, am revamping the curriculum is to identify different terminology and concepts and approaches that can go across groups. So introducing terminology such as intersectionality and getting to the both and pieces where we are talking about our social location as well as the influences of power and oppression, and having to dissect these conversations at a very ecological stance, very similar to what you saw in presented in the theoretical approach. And so I think that these conversations are starting to help us understand when we talk about concepts such as stereotypes, microaggressions, oppression, what is this doing for us when we're not equipped, and what are some therapeutic examples that we can bring into the classroom to help dissect and learn from a very active role and an active stance. So it is a shifting area of growth that I would say our field is having, but there's a lot of promise. I personally am very hopeful for the direction that we're going. And I see some folks resonating. I will say that I found myself a lot in a lot of these participants who they themselves identified as Latino or Latinx, and saying, I hear the conversations I'm having with my clients, and having gone through that myself, I'm able to resonate on a different level while also maintaining that boundary that my experiences were not theirs. I also had white counterparts who were saying there are just times where while I can, sit and try to understand my Latino clients, I can see, and even though I'm bilingual myself, I can see my counterparts who are just part of this cultural group and understand nuances that I just cannot pick up. So while there are still ways in which all therapists of backgrounds can definitely support Latino populations, there is just something beautiful and precious about being able to share an identity with the client in front of us and being able to resonate on a deeper level and give a new level of understanding. Oh, this is a great question in terms of age groups related to the children. So the children actually did fall out of the scope of the main dissertation. So therapists ranged anywhere from children of younger ages. I believe not many mentioned specific age ranges. So many just said, children. Some mentioned adolescents, and then in rare occasions, talking about adult children. So in some cases, the parents were holding dual role in the examples that were provided, where they were naming the experiences as a parent to their child, but also their own experiences to grandparent generation, and influences that were happening across generations. So I apologize, there's not as much thorough description, more so because the primary focus was the parents. Any thoughts or findings when there's racial discrimination from the client towards the clinician, ways to repair and need to address? That is a great question. And I think that's something that does happen quite often. And so therapists who have been put in this position, not so much that was described in this study, but I think between colleagues and networks that I'm a part of, first and foremost, we do a great job of discussing boundaries with our clients, but I think that there is a respectful way, very similar to how it was described in this study, that we tap into their humanity and understanding. And sometimes that just means approaching with curiosity and whether or not the therapeutic relationship can be repaired, and whether or not the services that we can provide to the client can be effective if there are certain beliefs that are held against us. And I think that that in itself can be very therapeutic, and being able to have those conversations in a very open and safe space. I know that that's not always the case, and unfortunately, when that does happen, typically that is where supervision will come into play, or if therapists are hopefully surrounded by networks that can support them through this, being able to once again find ways to navigate those conversations with clients, and then if necessary, referring out. But I do know that the therapists that I have worked with through these stages, the priority is the client, to make sure that they are okay and that they are put into a situation or with another therapist that can provide them support. And so then the therapist can take time to take care of themselves because we are human as well. And, it is still a sting for us just as much as our clients that experience discrimination. And so far, I think I've got all of them. If I missed your question, please re-pop it into the chat, and I would appreciate that.
Anyone, excuse me, if anyone has any remaining questions, please do submit it now through the chat. But otherwise, thank you everyone for your participation, and a big thank you to Dr. Melissa Isaguirre for sharing your dissertation and participation or presentation with us. I wish everyone a great afternoon, and we look forward to being with you on a future AAHHE program.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending today. Please follow up if you have any questions. Otherwise, take care and thank you for this incredible honor and recognition.
Absolutely. Thank you.